seems odd to cast a town as famously medieval as Salisbury as being a new town, but that, certainly in the context of the many older towns and cities that exist in England, is pretty much what it is. It was as late as the 28th of April 1220 that Salisbury was founded, when the foundation stone of a new cathedral, the Cathedral Church of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Salisbury Cathedral as it would become, was laid. And over the course of the next 38 years, a great cathedral would rise, this extraordinary building next to the water meadows of the River Avon. In my opinion, the most beautiful building, not just in England, but in the whole of Europe. And so absolutely something that is worth celebrating, and unsurprisingly all kinds of events were scheduled for this year, not just talks but services in the cathedral itself, exhibitions, concerts, shows, all of which of course have had to be cancelled because, as I hardly need to say, the impact of coronavirus has been devastating. And so Salisbury's birthday celebrations, although not cancelled, have had to take a slightly different course. And that's why, rather than standing up in a lecture hall or some other venue in Salisbury, instead I'm having to sit here and talk to you on a camera. In March 2018, 2 years before the arrival of coronavirus in Salisbury, 2 Russians arrived at Salisbury Station. Their ostensible aim, they claimed, was to visit the city, in particular to visit its world-famous cathedral with its 123-metre spire. But when they came out of the station, instead of turning right to head to Salisbury Cathedral, they turned left and headed for the house of another Russian, Sergei Skripal, where notoriously they applied a peculiarly toxic poison, Novichok, with results that would reverberate across the entire world. A chemical attack launched in Salisbury. And I think that for me, like everyone brought up in the city, the wound was felt as something incredibly deep. The damage that this attack did to the shops, to the businesses, to the tourism industry of the city was, of course, absolutely immense. But it also did something more. It seemed to strike at a sense of the city as somewhere calm, as somewhere beautiful, perhaps even just a little bit boring. The joking name of Salisbury, after all, is Snoresbury. But above all, it was a blow at the sense of Salisbury as one of the most beautiful places in the world. A sense given famous expression by Constable with his painting of not just the cathedral but the water meadows that the cathedral stands next to. An emblem of everything that makes England seem calm, beautiful, intact, free of violence, free of the cruelties and the batterings that history can inflict on places. And perhaps what was peculiarly painful was the sense that all the wealth and the wonder of Salisbury's history had been reduced to a kind of a snigger, a cruel giggle. Mention Salisbury to people beyond the city, and now you're almost inevitably going to get a reference to the 123-metre spire, as though in some way that's everything that Salisbury's history ever was, the punchline of a cruel and brutal joke. And so I think that's why a few weeks after the Skripal poisoning, I bought a coin, and this is it. And I bought it as a kind of a talisman, a good luck charm, a reminder that Salisbury's history was more than a poisoning, was more even than a 123-metre spire, because this coin is actually older than Salisbury and Salisbury Cathedral. It was minted in the reign of Harold Harefoot, a Danish king, the son of Knut the Great, reigned 1035 to 1040. Didn't have a particularly memorable reign. In fact, probably the most memorable thing about him is that after he'd been died and buried, his brother Harthcnut, who didn't like him at all, turned up in England, dug up his body and dumped it in a sewer. But be that as it may, this coin that I bought was minted in his name, and it was minted in the town that existed before Salisbury. So if you look close, you can see printed on this coin, we have the name Godwin, that's the name of the moneyer, and we have an abbreviation, Seer, and Seer is short for Siereberg, Sarum, and Siereberg is Old Sarum. It's the town that existed before Salisbury. But if this coin looks forward to the future, to the founding of the cathedral, so also does it look back to a past even more ancient than the time of Harold Harefoot, because before the Anglo-Saxon mint was established there, it had been a settlement under the Romans, who knew it as Sorbia Dunum. And Sorbia Dunum itself, the name Dunum, means essentially hill fort, and suggests that, quite accurately, that Sorbia Dunum had been a settlement even before the Romans came. So the roots of Salisbury are older than the Anglo-Saxons, older than the Roman period. It goes right the way back to the Iron Age and perhaps even before that. So having said that Salisbury is a new town, the idea of Salisbury, that's much, much more ancient. And this coin also reminds us of something else, that Salisbury is a part of a much wider, a much broader matrix, a matrix that is expressive of the sacral and of the regal. This is a place that has been very important for a very long time. There hadn't always been a mint on Old Sarum. Godwin, who was a very long-lived moneyer, had moved there with two other moneyers in 991, and he had moved from neighbouring town of Wilton. And Wilton, in the late 10th century, was a place as significant as any in the country, and it was significant again because it was the intersection point between the holy and the royal. It was the site of the great convent in the Kingdom of Wessex, what was rapidly becoming the Kingdom of England. And this seal, which almost certainly derives from this period and shows a royal princess, is emblematic of what it was that made Wilton and the Salisbury area generally so important to the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. So what this seal says in abbreviated form is Sigil Edith Regales Adelphi. This is the seal of Edith, royal sister. And so indeed she was. And it's very revealing about her character and about the qualities that she exemplified. Adelphi, interesting, it's not soror, it's not the Latin form of the word for sister, it's Adelphi, which is Greek, so expressive of the high standards of learning and scholarship that were focused in the convent at Wilton. And Regalis, royal, well, she was absolutely that. Even though after her death in 984 she was hailed as a saint, in her lifetime she had always very much been a princess. She was the daughter of King Edgar, a king who had been crowned with imperial splendour in Bath, who it is said had himself rowed down the River Dee by various client kings, so a man very keen on throwing his weight. And Edith, saintly and devout though she was was a great one for upholding the family dignity. She was notorious for her sense of fashion, and in fact, when a monk tried to berate her for this, she gave him very short shrift indeed. And she could have the confidence to do this, to combine royal status with a devotion to Christ and a devotion to learning, because that was absolutely what the royal dynasty she came from was all about. It was part of the tradition that had been embodied in Wilton, going all the way back to Alfred the Great, the saviour of Wessex, the saviour of England, who had founded the convent back at the end of the 9th century. And that convent in turn was part of a line of religious foundations in the area that went right the way back to Egbert, the king who had founded the kind of kingdom of Wessex. So when we look at Salisbury, when we look at Wilton, when we look at this area, what we're seeing is this kind of incredible fusion of power and the spiritual. And it's the combination of that that makes the area so distinctive. And it's a combination, of course, that actually is even older than the dynasty of Alfred and Egbert. It's older than Anglo-Saxon England. It's older than Roman England. It's older than the Iron Age. It's older than the Bronze Age. It goes back a very, very long way indeed. It's possible that the Salisbury region back in the 5th and the 6th centuries BC had a Europe-wide reputation. Around 500 BC, a geographer in Ionia, what's now the Aegean seaboard of Turkey, possibly is name-checking it. Certainly he writes in his geography about a land beyond the Celts, an island no smaller than Sicily. Certainly sounds like Britain. Britain certainly no smaller than Sicily. And Hecataeus writes about there being a magnificent sacred precinct of Apollo, a notable temple which is adorned with many votive offerings and is spherical in shape. Spherical in shape. And so that's why many have thought perhaps this is a garbled reference to the most famous spherical temple in Britain, which is, of course, Stonehenge. So Stonehenge, like Salisbury Cathedral, like the convent in Wilton, we know was certainly a place of sacrality, and almost certainly as well a great centre of power, a centre of power that was respected as such, very possibly across the whole of Britain. Certainly evidence has been found from the feasts that were held there of pigs being driven all the way from Scotland. So Stonehenge seems to have been an authentically pan-British centre. And that idea of the Salisbury area, the plain, being a centre is something even older than Stonehenge itself. And we know that because of recent excavations that have been conducted at a site just down the A303 from Stonehenge by Countess Roundabout, the site of Blickmead, where excavations have shown that this was a sacred site going right the way back to the Mesolithic, so almost to the very beginnings of continuous human settlement in Britain. And again, we know this because we have evidence of animals being driven there, great aurochs, kind of enormous oxen type creatures, their bones stacked high. The evidence of a dog that seems to have come from Yorkshire. So again, this sense that people are coming from all across this kind of nascent place called Britain, gathering there. And we also know probably what it was that was drawing people there, because very close to the excavation site in Blickmead, there is a spring, and it's a hot spring, so something would have been very appealing in the aftermath of the Ice Age as the glaciers were retreating. But it's not just the warmth that would have had a particular potency, but also the fact that if you drop white stones into the water, then miraculously, it seems, they turn purple. And so this spring perhaps is the beginning of this tradition that we can trace right the way through the centuries, these traditions that make Salisbury and the area around it such a remarkably potent and significant place. And it's very evident in the archaeology of this spring, because if you go through time, what you find is that people's responses to it stay the same even as they evolve. So we have offerings made in the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Roman period. It becomes the centre, a bit like Wilton, of an abbey in the Anglo-Saxon period. It stays that right the way through the Middle Ages, into the Reformation. And what we see is that the traditions in Salisbury, even as they change, nevertheless, in a really striking way, also stay the same. And perhaps nothing better exemplifies the creative way in which people who live in the Salisbury district, the creative way in which they have responded to the sense of the incredible history, than the manner in which, again and again, we see this history being cannibalized. And again, this is something that goes back a very, very long way indeed. And perhaps the earliest and in some ways the best example is what's known as the Salisbury Hoard. And this came to light in the early 90s when various objects began to appear in auction houses, being offered up to collectors. And it was apparent that a great hoard had been discovered but had not been reported to the authorities. The detectorists responsible were tracked down in 1995. They were prosecuted. They were given a 9-month suspended sentence. And archaeologists went to work on such of the hoard as remained in situ. And it turned out that it had been found on the Netherhampton, Salisbury and South Wilts golf course. Excavations went ahead. Archaeologists report they said that they'd found all kinds of golf balls, but in addition to the golf balls, they also found a spectacular array of ritual shields and 600 other objects. And what was fascinating about these objects was that they seemed to come from a remarkable span of time. And so the conclusion of the archaeologist who gave the report was this. He said, the artifacts from both the Bronze and Iron Ages, so that's centuries worth of material, were buried around 200 BC, by which time some of them would already have been antiquities in their own right. This sheds important light on the understanding of society in the British Iron Age and the notion of time and the idea of antiquity as understood by that society. So in other words, even in the year 200 BC, there were people in the Salisbury region who understood that they were living among the trace elements of a very remarkable history indeed. And if we want another example of this, one closer in time to us, well, we only have to go to the close itself, which was built to enclose the cathedral. People were given permission to build it in 1327, and the King, Edward III, specifically licensed the architects to take stone from Old Sarum. So the walls of the close which surrounds the new city were deliberately removed, transported, brought down and utilised in the building of the close around the new city, the new cathedral. And the results, well, it's one of the most beautiful places absolutely imaginable. If those spies, rather than heading off under the railway bridge, had actually come where they said that they were going, they would have seen one of the great wonders of European civilization. And no less a critic than Augustus Pugin, the great Victorian Gothic architect, the designer of the interiors of the Palace of Westminster, the Houses of Parliament. He said that he'd been all round Europe studying architecture, and yet when he came to the close, he'd seen nothing like it. So Salisbury is a place that knows how to use its past to create something new, to create something wonderful, to create something beautiful. Beautiful though Salisbury is, the cathedral, the close, beautiful though the landscape around it, its monuments, trace elements of this fantastic history, it is actually important not to romanticize it. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk the sense of shock that I felt at the thought of the Skripal poisonings happening in Salisbury of all places. But actually, reflecting on it, perhaps I shouldn't have been shocked, because Salisbury and the region around it has in fact always been a place of brutality, of killings, of vengeance. And perhaps that's not surprising, because if you have somewhere that is sacral, if you have somewhere that is royal, if you have somewhere that is important, then people are going to want to get hold of it. And that's why if an aura of the numinous, an aura of the holy hangs over the landscape, so also is it very easy for that aura to seem something faintly sinister, something dark. Certainly that is how people, in the early years of what the earliest responses that we're aware of to Stonehenge understood it. The name itself means a stone gibbet. People looked at it and seemed to have seen a great kind of row of stone gallows. And we know that people were executed there, that people seem to have been buried there. The body of somebody decapitated in the Anglo-Saxon period was found buried by the standing stone. So clearly this was a place of some darkness in the imagination of people back in the time of Alfred and Edgar and Edith. And when we think of Edith and we think of that beautiful convent in Wilton, we may well wonder, well, why on earth did Godwin and his fellow moneyers, why did they leave Wilton and head up for that much bleaker hill on Old Sarum? And again, this takes us back to the idea that the riches of the area are something that people have grasped after, that people have hungered after. Because the reason that Godwin moved in 991 is that this was a period when Wilton and all the region around it was coming under attack from the Vikings. Edith's brother was Ethelred the Unready, the king who famously ended up paying the Danegeld. And if he didn't pay the Danegeld, then the Danes would come and grab it. And that's what they were doing, turning up at Wilton. It was a wealthy place. It was therefore a place full of stuff for the Vikings to loot. And we know from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle how terrifying their appearance could be, because we have a description of the local elderman, the man with responsibility for defending Wilton. He comes to a ridge, he looks down at the Vikings, and we're told that the sight was so terrifying that he vomited on the spot and ran away. And that's why Godwin and the moneyers ended up on the much more secure spot that was Old Sarum. Nor should we think that the attack on the Skripals is the only example of violence and murder that the streets of Salisbury itself have witnessed. In fact, it's often stood at the epicentre of the various bouts of civil war that over the course of the Middle Ages and into the modern period convulsed the whole country. In 1483, during the reign of Richard III, who had usurped the throne from his nephew, Salisbury was the scene of one of the great denouements of Richard's short reign. His co-conspirator, the Duke of Buckingham, high-reaching Buckingham, as he's referred to in Shakespeare's play, he had turned against his co-conspirator Richard. He had tried to raise the standard of revolt, to rescue the princes held in the Tower. It had all gone wrong. Buckingham ended up cornered, tried in the market square in Salisbury, executed in the yard of a pub just behind the back of the market square on the very spot of what is now Debenhams. And to this day, it is said, the ghost of Buckingham can be seen walking the aisles of the lingerie racks in Debenhams, perhaps the only store in the whole of Britain to feature a beheaded ghost. Nor was Buckingham the only person who attempted to raise a banner of revolt and came clattering down the streets of Salisbury, because in 1655, in the wake of the civil war that had seen Charles I lose his head in 1649, Salisbury was the scene of a great attempted royalist uprising against the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. The person who led it was a colonel, John Penruddock. He came from the village of Compton Chamberlain, just outside Salisbury, a place very dear to me because I once took a hat-trick there in a cricket match. But long before that historic event, back in 1655, Penruddock led a revolt designed to part a revolt that was going to take place across the whole country, but everywhere it was suppressed without the royalists actually drawing their weapons. Everywhere, that is, except for Salisbury, where the banner of revolt was raised, the city was taken. Penruddock raised an army, led it westwards into Devon, where they were cornered, either captured or wiped out. Penruddock himself was taken to Exeter, where he was tried, sentenced to be hanged. Cromwell himself personally commuted the hanging and very graciously allowed Penruddock to be beheaded instead. Those of his conspirators who were less well born were sold and transported to Barbados, where they were put to work as slaves, although some of them, with the restoration of Charles II in 1660, did manage to make it back to Salisbury. And these tales of civil war, of course, Salisbury hasn't been at the centre of civil war since the 17th century, but it's not as though it's immune to war. It's not as though war is something that is distinct from it. Salisbury is very much a military city still, right up to this day. And that's something that, the implications of that was brought home to me a couple of years ago when I was helping my father to clean out some of his papers. My father had been, in the 80s, clerk to the parish council in Broadchalk, village just outside Salisbury. And I was going through the papers and found this red folder, very alarming colour, and started picking through, seeing what it was, and discovered that it was papers that had been sent to the parish council telling them how to deal with the consequences of a nuclear strike on Salisbury. And it was full of absolutely hair-raising phrases. Here, for instance, we have disposal of the dead. The dead raise many problems, which I imagine in the wake of a nuclear attack is putting it mildly. And then here we have the effects of radiation on livestock. How long is it going to linger? About 7 days for high radiation doses, where most of the animals will die. So that was the kind of material that my father was handling in the 80s. And of course, looking back to my own childhood in Salisbury, yeah, that was a period of incredible tension. And I remember being told at school that, I'm sure this isn't true, but it's always stuck in my mind, that in the event of a nuclear war, 2 bombs would go off over the North Sea to get rid of all destroy the electricity and everything. And then the third would go off over Beech's bookshop, which at the time was just beyond Salisbury Close. And this was designed to eliminate Salisbury because it was a key node in the NATO defence infrastructure. And looking back, of course, I remember that my romantic sense of Salisbury as a place of peace and calm and civilization is interfused with the memory of Salisbury actually as a place where, outside Wilton there are military bases with wire and signs with skulls on it, and then further afield you have Porton Down. And I remember very vividly when I was at school, my parents would come and pick me up driving back home, and I'd look at the cathedral and I would sometimes imagine, what would it look like if suddenly there was a great flash and then the spire was gone? And finding these papers took me back to that, a reminder again that the history of Salisbury, it's not just Snoresbury, it's not just about peace and calm and quiet. This is a place where people have had to face up to the worst of things as well as the most beautiful of things. And perhaps if there's one place that sums up the richness, the complexity, the antiquity, the sheer weirdness of Salisbury and the region that surrounds it, it would be the quarries outside the village of Chilmark, which have been providing stone for some of the key monuments that surround the region. Some facing stone found from here that ended up in Stonehenge. This is where stone that supplied local Roman villas came from, and it's stone that was used to build the cathedral itself. In the 20th century, it was used as a munitions base. Although I remember as a child, again, looking at these fences with their sinister looking signs and imagining all kinds of dark stories. People would say that nuclear missiles were stored there, that this is where in the event of a nuclear attack the government was going to come. So absolutely kind of classic stories associated with the area. And then when the Cold War ended, the munitions dump ceased to be a munitions dump, and instead it became a conservation area for bats. But its long history of strangeness had not ended with that, because in 2017 the police launched a raid on it and discovered that it was home to the largest cannabis factory in the whole of the southwest. So there you have it. I think a kind of perfect end to a talk on the history of Salisbury and the area all around it. A city that is not just beautiful, but in many ways dark, strange, rich, haunting. And so perhaps in a way the fact that rather than standing in a hall and giving this talk, I'm having to sit in a room because of the weirdness of the times, perhaps actually this is the perfect way to celebrate Salisbury's 800th birthday. So, Sarah, happy birthday to you.